CSIS 2470 is filmed before a live studio audience.
Today is the day we get fancy. We're going to be talking about some fancy function features. Here we go. As usual, there ain't nothing to it but to do it. To the code. So I got a few notes here to kind of help us through this. And I have a page here that's not going to be displaying anything in the document. It's just going to be all happening in the console here. So this particular lecture, there won't be any code to download because it's just going to be a bunch of hodgepodge little things. So let's just dive right into this. Let's just start off with what we already know. We know about regular functions, so I can have a function called add, and it can take in a parameter x comma y, and let's just say that we will console.log x plus y. Right, let's just start there, and then I'm going to call the function, so add, and we're going to put in there 1 comma 2, and I come over here and refresh, and I get 3. Right, pretty standard kind of a function that we already know all about, just a regular old function. But there's a few extra things you may not know about. So before we get to those, let's just talk about one other thing. Of course, there's the distinction between something like this function, which we call a mutator function, which it just does something and doesn't return anything. But then there's also functions that can return things, right? And so that might look something like this, where we say return x plus y. And then if I just say add 1 comma 2, nothing happens because the value 3 was returned, and this right here literally evaluated to 3. But it's just a 3 there. We didn't say to print it out or anything, right? So we want to say console.log this. So now when I refresh, we take that return value and then we console it out. Okay, this is pretty standard stuff. So next up, let's add another parameter here, and let's call it a default value of 0. Now what does this do? If I want, I can pass in 2 or 3 parameters. If I pass in 3 parameters, then the third one will go to z. So let's do 3 here. When I refresh, let's fix this so that it actually registers the z. Sorry about that. All right, now when I refresh, we get 6, right? It added 1 plus 2 plus 3. But if I decided to leave off that parameter right there, then it will just assume that I want the third value to be equal to whatever I have set for z right there. So now it'll just do 3 again. And there we go, 3. I can do that and have 2 parameters, right? Maybe I want y to equal 5 by default. And so I can leave off that parameter, and I just pass in 1 parameter, and it's going to add 1's going to go to x, and then y will be 5, z will be 0, so our total will be 6. Refresh, and we get 6. Now what if I wanted to pass something to z, but not to y? I wanted to skip y. Well, you could do this, put a comma there, and leave it blank in between, and then put, let's say, 10 for z. So this should give us a total of 16. Should give us 1 for x, the default for y, and then 10 for z. Sorry about that, folks. We had a little flashback there. Some languages it's commas like this. In other languages, like say JavaScript, you got to put undefined there. So sorry about the confusion there. So what this will do, it will take 1, give it to x. You'll take undefined and give it to y, which will tell it, hey, use the default, because I have an undefined parameter here. And then it'll give 10 to z. So that should give us a total of 16, and we refresh, and we get 16. Okay, some of that stuff you should have been familiar with. Some of it might be new, particularly the order of these default parameters where you can kind of skip around on which parameter you pass in. But let's look at a couple other things that you may not be aware of. And one of them is what we call the rest parameter, R-E-S-T, like the rest of the things, or maybe rest, like I'm taking a rest. But it's what we call in English an ellipsis. In the English language, when you're talking about writing, we call that an ellipsis. Where here we call it the rest parameter if I attach a name to it. So let's call it nums to add or something like that. You call it whatever you want. And now what this means is I can put in essentially an infinite number of parameters, right? And so we can't quite do this here. So let's comment that out for just a minute. But now if I want, I can say add 1 and 5 and 10 and 4, right? So how do I capture that data? Because what we've done is passed in 4 things in here. Let's just take a peek here and see what happens if I return the nums to add. Let's take a look at that, refresh, and look what we got here. Nice little array with 1, 5, 10, and 4. So all this does is just creates an array. Well, if that's the case and I just want to add them up, okay, let's just loop through the array like we know how to do. So we can do something like for num of nums to add, and we'll maybe have another variable out here called sum. We'll set it to 0, and my indentation's being weird here. I'm not sure what's going on there. There we go. And in here we'll say sum plus equals num. So the for loop is just going to loop through this array here and take sum, which is 0, and add each instance, right? So it'll add 1 the first iteration, then it'll add 5, then 10, and so forth. And then we'll just return the sum, and that should give us, what, 20 there? 1 plus 5 plus 10 plus 4 should be 20, and we get 20. So there you go, the rest operator, the rest parameter, I should say. Let's look at one other fun little, two other fun little things with regular functions, then we'll move on to the other not so regular functions. Thing number 1, let's go back to what we had a minute ago where we had some parameters here. We'll call them x, y, and z. And we'll clean up all this, and we're just going to return x plus y plus z, okay? And we'll get rid of that extra parameter right there. So now we're back to kind of what we were a minute ago. But to demonstrate what I want to show you here, we're going to do some different types of parameters here. And so we're going to say maybe take in a name and an age and a zip code, all right? Now this function may be buried levels deep in your code, right? And let's call this a person. It might be buried hundreds of lines deep in your code, and you don't remember the order of the parameters. You can't remember his age first or zip code first. You don't remember. And let's just say that this is going to output something like your name is. Okay, so now we have this. Right now, if I want to call this function person, I have to remember that name is first, age is second, and zip code is last, right? I have to remember that. Well, sometimes it's easy to remember. Other times you might forget. It might get a little messy. And again, if it's buried deep in your code somewhere and you just remember you had the function and you know what the parameter names are, you just don't remember the order necessarily. There's a way around that. And the way you do that is you have to build the function slightly differently. Just simply put this in curly braces, and you're essentially making an object here, which we're going to briefly talk about in a minute in this lecture, and then the next lecture is going to be all about objects. But that's basically what you're doing, is creating an object. And then now what you do here when you call the parameters is you wrap this in curly braces, but now instead of just saying Beavis 19 and 999, you can say, well, the name is Beavis and the age is 19 and the zip code is 999. And now it doesn't matter the order. So in other words, if zip code were over here and we passed in the parameters this way, it doesn't matter, because what we've done is passed in this whole object in curly braces, and it matches the pieces that it needs. It goes, oh, that's name, okay, that'll go here. That's age, okay, that'll go here. And that's zip, it'll go there. So when we run it, we get your name is Beavis, your age is 19, and your zip is 9999. So this can be useful in certain contexts. There are pros and cons. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. But one of the, quote, kind of cons is you're making objects here, right? And objects take up more memory. So it depends on the application and what you're doing. But this can be handy. Okay, one last little wonky thing with functions here. Let's come in here and let's go back to a normal, simple little function here. Return x plus y, and we'll call this calculate, and we'll take in x plus y. Well, not x plus y, what am I doing there? X and y. Okay, so we console.log x comma y, which will be 10 comma 3, let's say. Okay, this is back to what we were doing here, except I forgot to put the calc function there. Calc. All right, let's just run it, make sure I didn't screw anything up. All right, 13, okay. So what if we wanted to do another operation on y here? And maybe we want to do, like, I don't know, double it or something like that. And so the calculation function's job is to add x to y times 2. Now, obviously you can just do that right here, right? We can do that as well. Whoops. That'll get us, what, 16, right? 6 plus 10. Yep. So we can do that, and that's just fine. And for the example I'm about to show you, this is probably a better way. But just to demonstrate the point, I'm going to show you a little bit different way, because it can come in useful, and we will see it later. So I can actually have here a function other operation, and it takes in one parameter, y, and we will return y times 2. And now right here, other operation y. And so what's it going to do? It's going to take the y value right here. It's going to hand it off to this function here called y, which will return y times 2. And so now we'll have y times 2 plus x. We refresh, and we still get 16. It's exactly the same. But this is a nested function, right? It's nested inside of another one. Weird. Now also note, just like any other function scope, this y right here, it is this y, but it is not that y. So this value 3 gets handed off to that y right there. That y is this y. This y is the value 3, which gets handed here and assigned to a completely different variable called y, and is equal, and is then operated on right here on line 13. So to prove that point, these are different variables, a and a. I can call it that, and it's still going to work exactly the same here. And we still get the 16, right? So it could be confusing if I left it named y, because it's all inside this one function. But this set of y variables is one y with its own scope, and then this set of y variables is its own y with its own scope. But if you want to get confusing, right, I cannot use a parameter here, and then this y will be that y, because I didn't redeclare it in the parentheses, right? So it can get a little confusing, but you can see it's still the same there. Okay, that's a little messy, but I just want to make sure you're aware of some of the things you can do with regular functions. The next couple things we're going to talk about are pretty simple, straightforward, but they're kind of newish to JavaScript. They're a few years old now, but they're a little bit messy at first if you're not careful. So let's take a peek at that. Now this first thing, anonymous functions, we've actually talked about that already. So let's just quickly add an event listener. We're going to add it to the window, and we're just going to add a click. And actually we'll add a key press. And we will have a function that is called key stuff. Key stuff, right? And then the function down here, function key stuff, it will console.log the key code, right? So we'll take in the event parameter here, and it will be key code, right? So simple enough. I refresh, and now I'm going to type Beavis, and those are the key codes for Beavis. Let's actually do, I believe it's just key that will print out the actual key that was typed. So refresh, and Beavis, right? So that's me typing on the window, on the green window. But because the window's listening for a key event, it's registering that key event over there on the console. So in other words, I could say something like, you typed, right? And if I refresh and I type Beavis, every time I type it, it's just saying you typed, right? Okay, but we looked at this idea previously that I could, instead of making this function called key stuff, with a small function like this, I can just stick it right here. So let's go back to what we had before just for fun. E.key. And I can shrink this function up here, first of all, right here, like that. But you'll recall that we could actually take this out here, and this is just now an anonymous function with no name, and we could put it directly right there. And so now we have the event listener that's listening for key presses. That's the first parameter. What kind of event is it? And the second parameter is actually a function. It's a full function. Before it was the reference to a function, but now it's a full-blown function that has no name. It's an anonymous function, right? We've already briefly talked about this back in our event listener days, right? So that's an anonymous function. This also, event listener, add event listener, is also what's called a higher order function. All that means is that it can take in as a parameter a function, or it can return a function, right? In this case, it's taking in a parameter as a function. Maybe later we'll talk about functions that return functions. But a higher order function is just one that can take as a parameter a function and or return a function. We'll leave it there. So that takes care of anonymous. We've already talked about briefly, and that's the brief definition of a higher order function. Let's look at this arrow function business. An arrow function is just a syntactic shortcut. So let's make a function here that I can actually take an anonymous function. Let's make one here called function, and it's anonymous, and it's going to just simply return x plus y. And so it takes in the parameters x and y. Now this function right here by itself, we can't quite do that. So I can assign it to a variable, which is weird, but we'll call it add equals, right? This is another syntax you can use with functions. So let's call this down here. Let's get rid of this. and we will console.log add. And you'll see that this works here, no problem. This is not an arrow function. This is just another syntax. We refresh, and oh, sorry about that. I forgot to put the parentheses there and the event, right? Sorry about that. And now let's refresh that. That takes care of why I was getting that error. That was this first thing up here. So let's ignore that, just comment that out. But there were some bugs there, sorry about that. Down here though, let's look at this. We'll refresh it again, save, refresh, and we're getting 13. So this line on line 9 is the same thing as what we did before, which was function add, like this, right? It's the same kind of thing. You can do this one or this one. So I want to start there to get us to be able to see what's going on with this arrow function business. Just is this little weird looking thing here, like so. All right, what is this? Well, this piece replaces this piece, and then the curly braces are the curly braces, right? So I can get rid of the function word here, and then I can put this arrow here, and now this is the exact same thing. It's just a function with a different syntax. And so if we look here, I refresh, everything works exactly the same still. Weird, right? Now I'm going to shrink this up on one line here. So there's our simple little function. It's an anonymous function, but it's also an arrow function. It's an anonymous arrow function, right? And so we're assigning it to this variable add right here. In a minute, we're going to change that in just a moment. But I want to show you a couple syntactic things you can do here. Thing number one, if you're returning a value, you can actually get rid of the curly braces and replace it with parentheses and then lose the keyword return. So believe it or not, that will actually work. So if I refresh, still getting 13 there, right? And so I've taken the curly braces out and replaced it with parentheses. That works if you're just returning a value. And in fact, you don't even need the parentheses. Refresh, and it still works, right? Really kooky. Another fun thing with this syntax is if the parameters that you're passing in, if there's only one of them, you don't even need parentheses there. If I take the parentheses off right now, we're going to have a problem. So, right, I'm going to take those off and refresh, and we get a problem here. But if I just had one parameter, and let's say I was just going to return x times x or something like that, then this is a completely valid function. Refresh, and I get 100, right? Because I passed in 10. We didn't need that second argument there. I passed in 10, and it just said 10 times 10 and returned it. Now, this is messy and scary, and what we're really saying here is there's our set of input parameters. This is our return value, which normally would be written like so: return, curly brace, return, like that. And normally we'd have here function, right, with the parameter there. And we wouldn't have, excuse me, that curly brace should have been over here. Right? We normally have that as a function. Well, when you use the arrow syntax, if you stick this guy right there, then the function keyword vanishes. You don't need that anymore. When you're returning something, then you don't need the return keyword. Instead, you can use parentheses or no parentheses. At the bare minimum, in my opinion, you should do it this way with parentheses. Because in this thing where you can start leaving off parentheses, I mean, that is just messy syntax in my opinion. And that can get kind of scary, right? But it still works. Refresh, still get 100. Okay, why am I showing you all that?